Okay, we're now ready for the last speaker of this technical session, and this is Eric Larson, who comes to us from Princeton University. So GCEP doesn't just involve Stanford faculty, but we've actually engaged over 60 faculty members from around the world, and so anyway, we're delighted to have Eric here. He's a senior research engineer at the Energy Systems Analysis Group at the Adlinger Center for Energy and the Environment at Princeton University. He's also a senior scientist with Climate Central. His interests encompass clean and efficient energy supply and use in transportation, industry, buildings, and power generation. Recent emphasis has been on the design, simulation, and assessment of advanced processes for converting biomass and fossil fuels into clean transportation fuels and electricity with CO2 capture and storage. So please join me in welcoming him, and he will be talking about sustainable transportation energy with net negative carbon emissions.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak here, and this project is one that's it. This project is funded by GCEP, and my co-investigators and I are grateful for that support. And it's a joint project that we're doing at my Princeton group with folks at the University of Minnesota, Dave Tillman and Clarence Lehman, who are on the ecology side of things, and I'll talk about how we fit to work together on this. The basic motivation for this project is we think that carbon-based liquid fuels are going to be around for quite a while still, and in order to continue in the mix, we need to decarbonize in some fashion those liquid fuels. We're not going to be able to reach that 2-degree target if we continue business as usual. Sally alluded in her opening comments yesterday to the IPCC's assessment that we might need negative emissions, and biomass with carbon capture and storage is one of the more promising ways to get negative emissions, and so we're looking at that for liquid fuels. And biomass at the same time is a pretty scarce resource. There's not a lot of it around, so you have to be pretty clever and judicious about how you use it. And in the sort of a transition to a fully renewable energy system, we're probably going to need some kind of a coordinated use of biomass with fossil fuels. And that idea actually led us to some work that did a couple of years back, where we looked at systems for making synthetic hydrocarbon, non-alcohol hydrocarbon fuels by co-processing biomass and coal. And this shows you a carbon balance of this kind of a system, which we analyzed in quite a bit of detail. And it shows biomass coming in here from the left side, taking carbon out of the atmosphere as it grows. We're using, in this case, some coal. We're processing this and making a Fischer-Tropsch diesel and gasoline fuels and jet fuels, which then get burned and emissions go to the atmosphere. We capture CO2 along the way and store it. And when you get the mix of coal and biomass appropriately, you can get to basically zero net carbon emissions to the atmosphere. And we found that 30 to 40% biomass would be required in this kind of a system to get to net zero emissions. So zero isn't good enough in the longer term. So we're going to cut out the fossil fuel, and now you have a system that produces negative emissions. But and so we're going to be looking at a bunch of different ideas for processing biomass into hydrocarbon liquid fuels through this kind of a schematic, and we are adding to it one more negative emission source, which we're actually counting on our Minnesota colleagues to find for us, which is carbon storage in soil and roots as biomass grows. And we're looking particularly at growing biomass on degraded lands in the United States, which are carbon depleted as a result largely of overcropping over the years. And they have found, the folks at Minnesota have found that these soils will take up carbon at a pretty substantial rate as you restore them by growing biomass, which we would then harvest annually and use for energy in these kinds of systems. So the project goals are to basically identify and analyze promising pathways to biomass-based transportation fuels with negative emissions, and systems that we could plausibly imagine being implemented at scale by mid-century, which is the time frame in which we may need these kinds of systems. And there'll be several elements within this project. They're field studies. I should say we just recently gotten started with this work, so I won't have a lot of sort of new results to report, but I'm more to tell you about where we're headed and hopefully come back and tell you about results next year. Field studies of potential for growing non-food biomass on agriculturally degraded lands in the US, and there's a surprisingly large amount of this type of land, over 450 million acres, according to the USDA. And then we're going to be carrying out technology assessments of various routes to bioconversion, integrating both the supply side and the conversion aspects of the process in techno-economic assessments and environmental impact assessments, and then assess the potential for commercial deployment of different options within the time frame to mid-century. And that's kind of a critical factor in our analysis, is can we get these kinds of systems out there at scale within the next 35 years, which is not that far away. And then take a step back and sort of quantify, try to make some estimate on what kind of a national impact we might have for the US. And this is just a little diagram that shows how we're breaking down the work. On the right-hand side, Minnesota is working on the field studies of biomass production and understanding carbon storage in roots and soils. And on the left-hand side, we're doing the process design and analysis and sort of overall integrated systems analysis. So on the process design side, these are the classes of technologies that we're planning to look at in some detail. Gasification-based processes, and I won't go through these in detail because I won't have time, but basically all of these three routes are ones where you can make non-alcohol hydrocarbon fuels. The gasification-based systems are basically a Fischer-Tropsch type fuel, or you can make dimethyl ether, which Chris mentioned in his talk, or you can make synthetic gasoline as well. The catalytic hydropyrolysis is an interesting route for pyrolysis production of fuels, we think. It's basically doing pyrolysis in a hydrogen atmosphere, which avoids some of the secondary reactions that typically go on in a sort of conventional pyrolysis process. And then the third route would be biochemical processing. This might look somewhat similar to what's called cellulosic ethanol processing today, where you convert the carbohydrates in the biomass into sugars, and then you process those sugars through some sort of, in this case, it's aerobic microbial processing with various microbes, and that produces free fatty acids, which then get converted into hydrocarbon fuels. And in all of these designs, we're going to design systems that include carbon capture and storage, and that's something that hasn't, to our knowledge, hasn't been done on a sort of a self-consistent basis across a variety of different options. And when you're doing this kind of comparative analysis, it's important to have metrics to compare these various options. And so part of the effort is to come up with a good set of metrics that allow us to make meaningful comparisons between systems. And these metrics include greenhouse metrics, they include economic metrics, ecosystem metrics, and then this last one about commercial deployability in a relevant time frame. And I wanted to just show you some ideas that we have based on some of our earlier work on some of these metrics. This is a combination of looks like it didn't turn out very well on the bottom there, illustrating sort of an energy balance and a greenhouse gas metric. The biomass intensity, that's a ratio of the energy in the biomass that goes into the system divided by the energy in the liquid fuel that you produce from the system. So it's sort of an energy efficiency. And the greenhouse gas emissions index we're defining as our life cycle emissions from the system that we're interested in, divided by emissions from a reference system that would produce the same products. And that reference system we're taking as sort of the 2005 level of, for example, petroleum-based liquid fuels emissions. And the reason we picked 2005 is because that's the year against which carbon mitigation goals for the US tend to be measured. And so when you look at these, you can put on here different types of systems, and we've taken some numbers from the literature and some from our earlier work here. Cellulosic ethanol made from switchgrass, with or without CCS, you can see it's close to carbon neutral, that is zero greenhouse gas emissions index, and you need about 2.5 units of biomass energy to make a unit of liquid fuel energy. Fischer-Tropsch systems, these are gasification-based plants. Here we're starting with corn stover as a feedstock, again, a residue feedstock that won't have the same kind of land use impacts as taking good agricultural land to grow the feedstock. And what you can see here is that without CCS, you're close to zero on the greenhouse scale, and much more negative if you have CCS included. The amount of biomass you need is about the same as with the cellulosic ethanol, 2 to 2.5 units of biomass. Hydropyrolysis, we've done some initial calculations and designs on this, and it looks like it's in the same ballpark. Fischer-Tropsch fuels now, this is incorporating the idea of carbon storage in the roots and soils of the biomass from which you made the fuels, and now you can see a dramatic reduction in the emissions. You're still using the same amount of biomass to make the liquid fuel, but your emissions have dropped much more negative than with the other sources shown there. And then the last interesting points down here are when you combine coal with biomass to make liquid fuels, and now you can get, as I mentioned at the beginning, you can, if you balance the amount of biomass and coal appropriately, you can get close to zero emissions, but you've used a lot less biomass. And so this is a way to get carbon neutral fuel with use of a lot less biomass, and your biomass resource, which is scarce, is going to go a lot further. So maybe these are the kinds of systems that one would have in the interim term, and in the longer term, we go to systems that are pure biofuel based. Economic metrics, these systems are capital intensive, on the order of billions of dollars, $1 to $5 billion to build these kinds of plants that we're talking about. And so it's the more capital intensive they are, the harder they are going to be to finance and build. Internal rate of return on equity is obviously an important metric from the economic side, and then levelized cost of production of the liquid fuels is something that's easy to compare against competing, for example, petroleum fuels. And none of these systems, if we were to run through the economics today, would make any sense, probably even at the $100 a barrel oil, and we're at 50, I think, or in that order today. But as we look to the future, the value of negative emissions is maybe quite a bit higher. And this is from the IPCC's 5th assessment report. It just shows the trajectory of carbon prices that they would anticipate if you're trying to meet a 2°C scenario. And you can see that by mid-century, and these are a bunch of different models that were run, and so they're different numbers for different models, but the median value out in 2050 is about $200 a ton of CO2. And when you have that kind of a carbon mitigation price, then the economics change pretty dramatically. One complicating factor in our comparisons, and we haven't quite figured out how we're going to deal with this yet, but is that technologies are at different levels of development at this point, and that complicates not only the economic analysis, but also the thermodynamic analysis that we're going to go through. And that's illustrated here with a comparison of a couple of different cases that shows the levelized cost of producing these liquid fuels. And in the red is gasification-based systems, which basically we know how to build today. We could build these, and we're showing a range of costs that reflect a range of estimates for capital costs for these systems. And then and those systems have a technology readiness level around 7, and TRL scale is one, for those who aren't familiar, is used to sort of categorize where a technology is on the path to being commercial reality, with 1 to 9 being the scale, 9 being commercially, basically commercial technology. So we're at about a 7 here, but here we're at a 4. And the 4 looks a lot better right now, especially at low carbon prices. But we need to figure out a way to incorporate the uncertainty. There are ideas like chemical looping-based gasification that are out there that may dramatically reduce the cost of gasification options. So we're still figuring that one out. And then land-related sustainability metrics are important. And this was an article that several of us published a few years back in Science that sort of said that we really need to, if we want to minimize impacts of biofuels, we have to focus on either using agriculturally degraded lands to grow the biomass and or residues. And so our focus is going to be on those kinds of feedstocks. And in turn, we'll evaluate the metrics and the impacts that they have on sort of sustainability with these sorts of criteria: soil productivity, water and air impacts, direct and indirect land use impacts, both on greenhouse gas emissions and food production. And I wanted to spend just a couple minutes talking about the Minnesota work. I think it's the folks from Minnesota will do a much better job of describing their activities, but this will give you a flavor of what they're doing. On the biomass production side, they had started an experiment over 20 years ago where they cleared a huge plot of land, scraped off the topsoil to basically simulate degraded land, and then began to run experiments on how to restore that land back to productivity. And they looked in particular at the idea of growing single species monocultures or growing multiple species to see what kind of impact essentially species diversity would have. And the database that has been built up over 20 years has a lot of information in it that has not been mined yet for lots of different potential reasons. And so they're going to be going back and mining their data to look specifically at data that are relevant for our project, as well as establishing some new trials as well, which I think some of the students did this past summer out in the field. So what they found that on degraded land, and this is past work that sort of motivated this whole idea of this project, is that when you have a diversity of mixtures on the land, they store carbon in roots and soil, organic matter over time, and these are perennial crops. And it's important that the species are mixed, and I'll show you some results. Here, this is, let's just look at the right-hand side. This is the number of species that were planted and the amount of soil carbon that was stored over, well, in different years on the left-hand side, and then sort of comparing the species numbers directly here on the right-hand side. And you can see that with higher diversity, you get higher carbon storage. And these are, in almost all cases, these are low input systems. The idea is you don't want to, the initial idea was to restore these prairie lands back to sort of native productivity. So you're not fertilizing and things like that. But that may be an option if you're looking to optimize biofuel systems, and we'll explore that. They also, based on the 20 years of data, it looks like this soil carbon storage is going to persist for on the order of a century or more. So it's a long time frame period process, but also substantial storage on an annual basis. So this is a example of the kind of thing they'll do. They'll mow the grass and turn it into bales. Students here measuring how much energy is in the bales, and they have data like this that we're going to be able to draw on. And this is the above ground results, similar sort of plot of plant species, number of species against the above ground biomass productivity. And for those of you who are familiar with these kinds of numbers, this is 3 to 4 tons per hectare per year of productivity, which is pretty low if you're interested in the economics of biofuel production. But because the inputs are so low, the economics may still work out, and it may be possible to boost those yields. And again, it depends a lot on what the carbon, the value of the carbon avoided is. There's also data on things like nitrate removal from the soil, which has an impact on the quality of the runoff water. And this again shows that the more species you have, the better the absorption of nitrates from the soil, and so you'll have better water quality. And then they also have measures about impacts on wildlife and animal biodiversity. So you can see in the growing season you have a mixture of species. The wildlife tend to enjoy it, and they go out and survey how many amphibians and reptiles and so on that they find in the fields. They go out and catch butterflies and figure out how many butterflies there are per hectare and that sort of thing to basically come up with a quantitative metric for the ecosystem sustainability. They also couple that with small-scale plots where they're more exhaustive in their measurements. So there's a rich database out there, and the idea is that the harvesting would be done after the senescence of the vegetation, after the migratory wildlife have left to go south and so on. So at Minnesota, I won't go through this whole list because I'm running a little bit short on time, but there are a number of things that we're planning to do to look specifically at how you would tailor these sorts of degraded land restoration efforts to the production of biomass for biofuels. And for example, looking at fertilization, looking at strategies for maximizing soil carbon storage, and so on. And I just wanted to mention this last bullet here is that the idea would be once we have an understanding of the mechanisms that are involved in these processes, to come up with a national level model where we could look at areas, regions outside of where the actual experiments were done and be able to project some idea of what kind of productivity you could get. And on that basis, we can come up with a national sort of projection of the potential for degraded lands to provide biofuels for the country. And I wanted to just finish with this, that national projection that the folks from Minnesota will do on the biomass side will let us do these kinds of thought experiments for the US as to how much of our transportation energy needs we might meet in the mid-century time frame. And this was a thought experiment that we did for the global energy assessment a couple years back at the thought experiment at the global level, but it gives you an idea of where we're headed in our project here. This is the transportation energy requirements in 2005. This is what was projected sort of as a business as usual scenario by the International Energy Agency to 2050. And you can see carbon emissions would be roughly double under this business as usual scenario. They also proposed what they called a blue map scenario, which was a much more efficient world, some electrification of transportation. We took that blue map scenario, modified it a bit, and said, let's assume we're going to do all of our transportation with liquid fuels, and we come up with an energy demand primarily by getting much more efficient vehicles. I don't think Amory would have any problem with the efficiency levels we've assumed here. And you have your transportation energy is roughly what it was in 2005. And the question is, what are the carbon emissions associated with that? Could we meet this kind of demand with biofuels? And so the next part of the calculation was to look at technologies that we had some understanding about. This is the idea of coal and biomass co-processing with CCS, and you get basically zero emissions with those liquid fuels, as I mentioned. This is a pure biomass system with CCS, and so you have negative emissions there. And then those negative emissions essentially leave room for continued petroleum-based fuel use to a fairly significant extent, and you can still end up with zero net emissions, right? And that was by design. We said, what would you have to do to get to zero emissions for the transportation system? And then how much biomass would you need to do that? And it turns out that the amount of biomass is roughly how much biomass there is in residues around the world, projected for 2050. And then there's a lot of degraded lands globally as well as in the US, and to use those for growing grasses in the style that the Minnesotan folks are doing would provide the additional biomass. And that biomass we didn't include soil and root carbon capture in that case. So the balance might be better if we assume some carbon capture in the soil and the roots there. And so the total is about 100 exajoules of biomass, and that's comfortably within most estimates of what sustainable biomass supply might be globally. There are estimates that are out there of 300 or 400 exajoules per year, but so we feel that this is a pretty comfortable number. So it looks like despite the limited availability of biomass, it can go a long way if we're both efficient about how we use it and clever about how we convert it into liquid fuels. So I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks. So my understanding is that over very long time periods, some grassland sort of ecosystems will continue to add soil carbon. So my understanding that was that, for example, the mid-North America region, since deglaciation, has sort of continued to add soil carbon under sort of native or sort of traditional ecosystems. Is there a sense in which we really understand when soil carbon would stop being added, or can we just continue to rely on this in the future as a source of storing carbon? I guess the mental model I have is things like peat, where carbon is deposited and effectively stored there for what look like geologic timescales. So why would this stop, and can we rely on this in even longer term than we currently think?
Yeah, I won't be able to give you a complete answer. That I think the folks at Minnesota would be able to, but the modeling that they've done that I've seen is based on specifically on these degraded lands and that they showed that after about 150 or 200 years, you sort of level off the carbon storage in those types of lands. I think at some point there becomes an equilibrium, but I don't know where that is.
I think you are conservative on the demand side, because our biofuels number was about 3 million barrels a day for the U.S., or 6 exajoules a year in 2050. But I'm very intrigued by the ecological results, which are reminiscent of the Land Institute's Perennial Polyculture in Salina, Kansas. I was wondering if you looked at their data. And also, I wonder if any of the folks doing those experiments have looked at mycorrhizal supplementation. The way Willie Smits restores devastated tropical rainforests with 1,400 species of trees is to plant them with mycorrhizal symbionts, and then they really go to town.
I know that the productivity gains that come from using multiple species is largely because of the nitrogen-fixing species that are mixed in with the others, and I think that's along the lines of what you're talking about.
They sponsor their own nitrogen fertility and pest resistance, everything else. No inputs. You just sit there and watch it grow.
Right.
And then you harvest it with combines or ungulates.
Right. They weren't using the ungulates, but they were harvesting it. Yeah, that's exactly right. And the first part of your question was?
Well, Land Institute. Okay. They've done a lot of great work on perennial polyculture. Basically imitating the tall and medium grass prairie, because if there for a better way to use the sunlight, it would have been there already.
Yeah. So I'm sure that Dave and Clarence at Minnesota are familiar with that, but I'm not.
Very great talk. I was just going to ask you, what you're showing is some options are available for going to negative greenhouse gas emissions that can produce high-density liquid fuels. So my question is, do you have a view on where those negative greenhouse gas emission cases you have would lie on the IEA chart on cost for greenhouse gas mitigation? And that would be dependent on the crude price, because you're replacing a crude-based barrel. So my question is, have you or anyone else looked at where the schemes for negative greenhouse gas?
So we've looked at where sort of the cost of carbon avoided would be for some of these systems. And it's in the system I'm most familiar with is the gasification-based route. And if you're when you do gasification-based processing, as you probably know, you're removing CO2 because you need to for process reasons, and then capturing it is a matter of just compressing it and sending it for storage, which is a much cheaper part of the overall process. So the actual cost of CO2 avoided is pretty low for those systems, $20 to $30 a ton on that order, and that's independent of the oil price. Essentially, it's just what it costs. But in terms of the cost of production itself, you're quite high, so that it's almost doesn't almost make sense to talk about the cost of CO2 capture in that sense. We're talking about $150 or $200 a barrel oil equivalent if you don't have any carbon mitigation policy that's incentivizing.
Hi. There's a company in Berkeley that's doing biochar, pyrolysis, gasification and pyrolysis on a pallet, for like, comes down to something like 2 or 3 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's assuming waste product for thing. But I'm thinking you could use, you mentioned forest residues in your slides, and you also talked about, I saw on the slide that char was taken to combustion. But if you take char to biochar and just put it in the ground, you're going to increase water retention and nutrient retention and availability to the plant rootlets. And then he talked about, Emery talked about the one kind of mycorrhizome thing. There's also compost tea. So you take compost with lots and lots of bugs in it, you brew it for 24 hours in a truck we got in the driveway, and you get 100 gallons of compost tea, which basically inoculates the soil, and you wind up with what the soil food web lady talked about, which is clusters of these things that surround each rootlet and provide the nitrogen and the minerals in soluble form to it. So the last piece is that the forest, with 100 years of no burn, no fires allowed, as land policy in the United States, we have lots and lots of forests that are way overgrown compared to how it was when it was managed by the indigenous peoples. So we could go through and systematically thin those, turn and chip, take lumber out of it, chip the rest. The soft tissue goes into compost and humus, and that'd be a large scale input.
Yeah, so there's lots of points you made there. I think on that last one, you'd have to look at the costs of doing that, and that's sort of the dispersed nature of biomass makes it costly generally to get it to a facility, but it's certainly worth investigating. You take the pallet out, you do it right on site. So the other point on char, I should mention, I think there's a GCEP project where biochar is being investigated, and we're actually in conversation with the folks at Iowa State? I think it's Iowa State, University of Iowa State, where we're going to take some char from their work and try it on one of Dave Tillman's plots in Minnesota and see what kind of an impact we have there. We won't be able to investigate all those things that you've mentioned, but they're worth looking at.
Okay, another question. I've got a question for you. So can you go back to the chart that you have the cost of the two different
Yeah.
systems for making the liquid fuels? Yeah, that one. So how do those compare to the costs for? How does that compare to the cost for? How do those compare to the costs using corn-based ethanol or gasoline from fossil fuels?
Yeah, so we sometimes show this result in terms of a break-even oil cost equivalent, and that would give you some idea. We didn't do that here because we're not sure that these things are actually, the hydropyrolysis option is a substitute for crude oil. But in the case of the gasification one, the red one, as I mentioned to the answer to the earlier question, we're probably at $150 to $200 a barrel equivalent break-even price for oil for that at zero carbon emission price.
Okay.
Does that?
Yeah, okay. Okay, all right, thanks.
It's not quite that, because
Okay,
there's a
we have
refinery
a question
margin
back
involved.
there.
One quick question. You said something like over 400 million acres, over 400 million acres in the United States were degraded?
Yeah,
Is that correct?
yeah.
Okay, and there's 300 and some odd million people. It apparently takes about 10 acres of eastern hardwood forest to run a Prius. In other words, to make up for the emissions from a Prius. So that would seem to indicate that there's a pretty short horizon into the future for this kind of thing to actually work reliably without trying to find other places in the world to dump the CO2 into. So what do you have to say about that?
Are you saying that the absorption of
Yeah.
10 acres is the CO2 equivalent of
Yeah, running a Prius.
running a Prius?
Typical American.
Yeah, so what we're talking about is growing the biomass on an annual basis. So we're mowing the grass every year and turning
Right.
that into liquid fuel, and that's the fuel that goes into the Prius.
Right.
And that carbon goes back to the atmosphere and gets absorbed the next year. So it's just a cycle.
Right, but the net carbon sequestration, you said, is flattening off, is leveling off.
Oh, so there over a 100-year period or so, there's going to be a leveling of the soil carbon buildup, but we're still sucking carbon out of the atmosphere as
Right.
for geologic storage.
Right.
Yeah. So it's not. I'm not sure I'm understanding the question, but it's.
Well, I'm just wondering about the nonlinearity and the eventual threshold where it's not going to actually
Yeah, I mean
be profitable, environmentally profitable.
The important point, I guess, is that we need to be, and we're going to look at this. I didn't mention it, but on the demand side, we need to be pushing beyond Priuses as well, so that we can make our renewable resources go that much further.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Okay.